Many of you have been asking for a history video on the Earth government, known as Earth Gov in the Dead Space series. In this video, we will be looking through the history of Earth Gov from the broken and scattered records. However, I will warn you that the history of this tyrannical organization have been most likely blacklisted in the franchise. Therefore, a lot of their history has been covered up by their operatives. However, I will do my very best to try and fill in the blanks for you. During the global warming epidemic, the loss of land, resources, and the increase of refugees had made our everyday lives very hard to survive. This would lead into all of the nations of the world becoming one entity to govern over humanity, known to be the Earth government. However, within time, and with the dwindling resources on Earth, they knew that they would have to find a solution for this issue very soon. With the first of many space vessels being crafted and built, the government decided on creating a new organization to colonize new worlds upon discovery, which would lead into gaining new resources to help them in their current plight. This would lead into the creation of the sovereign colonies, who would govern over human space territories and colonize new worlds to solve the growing overpopulation issues and the resource crisis, while the Earth government governs over the Earth, doing their very best to maintain peace and prosperity. Over time, however, the Earth government would slowly start to unhinge from the inside out, becoming corrupt. They would start to do what was within the government's best interests, rather than the people's, which would lead into civil unrest, resulting in protests which would be forcefully shut down by the SCAF division under the rule of the Earth government at that time, which would then lead into riots. Tensions between the sovereign colonies and the Earth government would near the boiling point due to the corruption and the mass civil unrest. Their relations would only get worse once the black marker would be found in the Gulf of Mexico, and Dead Space Martyr begins. After the seed of unitology began, Altman became their martyr, and the black marker lost. The sovereign colonies, by requests of its colonial council, would send in SCAF division teams to relinquish the Earth government's power and control, and investigate into the civil unrest, which would lead into the sovereign colonies taking full control over all human territories, including Earth. In the following years, the remnants of the Earth government would start to manipulate the resource-stricken situation on Earth to create an uprising that would blow into a full rebellion soon afterwards to combat the tyranny of the sovereign colonies, putting the collapse of the government on the SCAF division in hopes of re-establishing control in building a new Earth government. The conflict between the Earth rebels and the sovereign colonies would take an interesting twist in that the defense force would also take up arms against the sovereign colonies, which would dramatically change the course of the war. In 2294, the events of Dead Space Catalyst would begin. EarthGov had begun conducting marker experiments in a political prison on the planet of Asperia, which would consist of using prisoners as test subjects, showing the first of many acts of disregard for human life. Soon after 2314, the sovereign colonies would be defeated and overthrown and assimilated into the folds of the new government known as EarthGov. Thanks to the efforts of the sovereign colonies scuttling their independent research on the markers and burying any and all ties to the marker research, EarthGov would struggle in their research of these accursed obelisks for at least 2 centuries. EarthGov would start constructing sectors for certain stations and colonies, which would include public sectors and government sectors. Some colonies would also house unitology sectors, but most of unitology would fall under the public sector. Only by request of church leaders would this be changed within EarthGov public relations. EarthGov would also ban any mention of Altman's disappearance. All major publications of Michael's assassination, such as The False Messiah, would be treated as hate speech, thus banned within Earth and the colony's public libraries. After this, EarthGov would establish contracts with commercial corporations to benefit from the planet-cracking business financially. These corporations would include the Concordiance Extraction Corporation and the Galactic Union Marine Corporation, over which the government wields considerable power. and is authorized to determine the legality of corporate mining operations. The locations that EarthGov would govern over would be as follows: Venus, Earth, Luna, Mars, Titan Station, Borealis, Asperia, Crema, Aegis 7, Scorpio 6, Phalanx 3, Uxor, Keyhole Station, Heliopause Observer, Deniba Colony, Rigelian Colony, and the Orion Territories. EarthGov is deeply entrenched in the affairs of colonial politics, business, and military administration. It holds the power to control travel throughout colonial space and, if required, to police, establish curfews, and restrict travel in certain areas, as well as dispatch military and naval forces to remove elements believed to ignore or threaten its orders. These operations are not restricted to just marker research, but to other avenues as well, like the cover-up on the disappearance of Paula Clark, Isaac's father, and what happened in Aegis 7, that would be broadcasted to all human territories at the end of Dead Space Aftermath. The operatives would also have missions to assassinate key targets and to collect specific resources to further fuel operations and research that EarthGov would rather keep under wraps. The operatives would silence those who posed a significant threat to the safety of their civilization. Those who would create unrest and chaos with their words would be put down so that EarthGov could continue with their terrorism on the public within the shadows. EarthGov would also employ spies and agents to infiltrate certain key areas or locations of particular interest to them. It could also be seen that Kendra Daniels from Dead Space was in fact one of these individuals who would be assigned to infiltrate the emergency response team and recover Marker 3A, or the red marker, and transport it back to the Sprawl for further study. During their expansion, EarthGov would employ several teams of scientists and researchers in hopes of recreating a marker. However, they would come up to a bit of a roadblock. They would eventually pore over the old Sovereign Colony files to get a little bit more information, enough to know of its properties but not enough to replicate one for themselves. The scientists would theorize that the effects of the marker on the brain was more of a mental blueprint than insanity for the construction of new markers. They would follow up on this research to build the machine in Titan Station that would be designed to pull the marker codes right out of the brain via a needle to act as a bridge between the test subject's brain and the recording software. All they would need now would be the necessary test subjects. That's where the events of Dead Space would come in, where a pleasure cruiser would report that they received a distress signal coming in from an executive CEC shuttle within the restricted Aegis cluster. EarthGov would become curious as the system had been under lockdown for quite some considerable time, that being the last 2 centuries. They would send a recovery patrol to the suspected location, and after some searching they would find the shuttle floating among some planetary debris adrift in space. Once they had entered the shuttle, they would find a crazed Isaac. After sedating him, they would take him back to the ship and interrogate him about what he was doing in the restricted system, where he would reveal to them everything about the colony, the Ishimura, what their mission would have been, what they had found, and the conclusion to his tale. The interrogators would put him under stasis and take him back to the Sprawl. The overseer in charge of the marker research would have been overjoyed to hear the rather disturbing tale that one engineer faced these horrors and survived, for them to experiment on him, but even more happy to hear that he had an interaction with Marker 3A. The overseer would theorize that if one were to recreate the events of Dead Space, then one would have more test subjects to use in their experiments. EarthGov would send the USG O'Bannon to travel to Aegis 7 so they can retrieve as much of Marker 3A as they possibly could, so they can replicate it for its raw power, which could hold the key to solving humanity's issues with resources like a eco-friendly powerhouse that would be constant. Thus, EarthGov would tell the captain of the rewards that would be in store for when they returned to the Sprawl with their prize. However, soon after arriving, EarthGov officials would lose communications with the O'Bannon, so they sent the USM Abraxas to their last known location, where they would find the 4 survivors of Dead Space Aftermath. Earth Gov would receive criticism by their contracted corporations, stating that if they did not find out the cause for the loss of communication in Aegis 7, then they would. Forced into a corner, the government knew they needed something compelling to fool everyone and effectively cover up the entire story of Aegis 7 for good. Despite their efforts, they could only find two key subjects within these events, those being Nolan Stross and Isabel Cho, where Stross would be put under the same experimentation of Isaac, and Cho would be lobotomized for refusing the Overseer's offer and put on show as a terrorist who slaughtered the crew of the USG Ishimura, USG O'Bannon, and the Aegis 7 colony. The public would praise EarthGov for their success in finding out the cause of the disturbance in Aegis 7 and putting an end to it. However, they would soon learn the disturbing truth, not just about who their government really were, but about what really happened on Aegis 7, which would lead to EarthGov's fall from grace. After collecting the mental blueprint from Isaac and Stross via the machine, the scientists and researchers of Titan Station began constructing the new marker that would later be named as Marker 12B, and the research after its construction would be named the Gold Marker Research. They would also construct a protective shell around the marker, not only to protect their prized possession, but to also ensure the safety of the public sector. Unfortunately, in 2511, the marker would find ways of leaking its signal through the containment field and into the mines that would spark an outbreak, leading up to the destruction of itself and the Titan Station. In the aftermath of the destruction of Titan Station, EarthGov would be under pressure from the public and the church to provide answers for the loss of the sprawl. Unable to provide valid reasons for that outcome, they would fall back on terrorism being the explanation. However, the church would not believe this a second time and would get fed up with the refusal to give more information on the marker experiments. Tensions between Unitology and EarthGov would begin to clash on the protection of information, which would force the church to begin an information war against them, while EarthGov continues their research on the markers, building marker research structures within colonies across their territories. Just like the Earth Rebellion, Unitology would use their influence and manipulative tactics to further pull the public to their side, which would lead into civil unrest and a goal to release the marker from the shackles of the tyranny of EarthGov. In the following year, a sub-faction of Unitology called the Circle would soon rise to power and would become a significant threat to EarthGov, which would lead them into clashing over the battlefields of colonies and skirmishes in space. EarthGov, stunned by the start of the conflict, would start to lose their ground on certain key locations. However, the Circle lacked the numbers to completely defeat and start a galactic rebellion against them, but this didn't concern them, as their main goal would be to save the markers, which they would succeed in, creating more and more necromorph outbreaks. At the end of 2513, EarthGov's formation would be on the decline, losing forces to not just the Circle, but to necromorph outbreaks as well, giving the Unitologist fanatics the upper hand in the conflict. And in 2514, the conflict would slowly come to an end, with EarthGov's final resistance and public structure falling into darkness. The Earth government reigned for 200 years before their eventual demise, in which they had committed war crimes such as experimenting on political prisoners and prisoners of war. In the peace times of humanity, they committed acts of terrorism and tyranny on the people they claimed to serve, using them as cattle to further serve their own goals. And when things went south, they would use survivors of necromorph events as scapegoats. They used manipulation and dirty tactics to eliminate the sovereign colonies, only to have the same returned upon them by the Church of Unitology's, the Circle. It just goes to show you that the old saying, what goes around comes around, actually does exist. Unfortunately, a worse entity is bound to fill the dead space that EarthGov has left vacant. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video or are loving the Dead Space lore, then give the video a like rating. Tell me what you think below and I'd look forward to hearing from you. Sign up to join the British Alliance today by subscribing and ringing in the notification bell for more updates on future content, streams and community posts. And if you're feeling even more like a champion of the British Alliance, then become a member of the channel today by clicking the join button and signing up for the membership for exclusive rewards. And I will see all of you on the front lines, and have a good one.